We are following two major twists in the Gene Hackman Betsy Arakawa death investigation. Turns out Gene Hackman's wife didn't die on the day that Santa Fe investigators first laid out, and a big request from those now in charge of the Hollywood legend's $80 million estate. Hackman didn't list his kids in his will, and the person he did plan to give it to, his wife, is now dead. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. New questions are being asked now nearly a month after Hollywood legend Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa Hackman, were found dead inside their Santa Fe, New Mexico home back on February 26th. If you remember, it was on that day a contractor came to their house and eventually deputies found Hackman and Arakawa dead inside the home. One of their dogs was also found dead in a confined space. Arakawa was in a bathroom and appeared to have fallen suddenly because there was a space heater on the ground with her that looked to have fallen. Pills were scattered on the counter. The 95-year-old Hackman was found dead in a mudroom with sunglasses and a walking cane nearby. From the start of the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office investigation, they said there were no signs of foul play, but it was a mystery as to how they died and just how long they were dead for. The couple was very private. They lived in a $3.3 million home in Santa Fe that was secluded, that had no security cameras. Eventually, officers discovered that Hackman's pacemaker recorded its last event on February 18th. The medical examiner said that Hackman died of a combination of cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's. As far as Arakawa Hackman, the medical examiner found that she had a rare but dangerous infectious disease called hantavirus that's carried by rodents and has similar symptoms initially as the flu. The Department of Health in New Mexico says there have only been 156 cases of this in the last 50 years in the state, but more than 40% of those cases are fatal. Here's what Santa Fe County Sheriff said on March 7th about Betsy Arakawa Hackman's death, and at the time they had recorded her last known moments to be on February 11th.
We know from our investigation that on February 9th, 2025, she picked up Zena from Gruta Veterinary Hospital. There was a procedure that was done with the dog, which may explain why the dog was in a crate at the residence. Let's move on to February 11th, 2025. Mrs. Arakawa had an email conversation with her massage therapist at about 11:21 a.m. Moving on into the afternoon, Ms. Arakawa was at the Sprouts Farmers Market between 3:30 and 4:15 p.m. Ms. Arakawa was seen on surveillance video at the CVS Pharmacy in Santa Fe from 4:12 to 4:20 p.m. She then stopped at a local pet food store at about 4:54 p.m. Her car was seen on surveillance, and the remote control clicker that is assigned to her and her vehicle was used to enter the subdivision to gain access to the gated community at 5:15 p.m. Numerous emails were unopened on her computer on February 11th. There was no additional outgoing communication from her or known activity after February 11th, 2025. The cell phone information and the cell phone data is pending. We're working with state police to get the information from those phones.
Turns out the phone data that came back shows that she actually died the next day, a day later than police originally reported. It showed that Arakawa Hackman made multiple phone calls to a local health clinic on the 12th, seeking care for the disease that would kill her later that day, according to deputies. The BBC spoke with the head of Cloudberry Health, who said that Arakawa talked of congestion but didn't mention breathing issues or chest pain. Arakawa had scheduled an appointment for the 12th, but she canceled on the 10th, saying that she needed to care for her husband, Gene Hackman. This means that Gene Hackman still spent days inside that house with his wife's dead body in the bathroom. The medical examiner did say, health-wise, Hackman was in rough shape after she examined his body. As for the dog, according to this report, it didn't die of an infection like Arakawa did, but a lack of food and water. The dog recently had a procedure and was being confined to a carrier. The couple had 2 other dogs that were found alive on the property, and they've both been reportedly taken to a local shelter for care. Now there are questions about what will happen to Gene Hackman's estate, one that's been built up over a career of 40 years of being a Hollywood A-lister. According to Entertainment Weekly, that estate is worth $80 million, and Hackman left it all to his wife. Hackman has 3 adult children from a previous marriage, 65-year-old Christopher, 62-year-old Elizabeth, and 58-year-old Leslie. None of them are listed as beneficiaries in Hackman's will, which was reportedly signed in 2005. Even with the timeline of Arakawa dying 24 hours after what was first thought, that doesn't change the reality that she died before Gene Hackman did, raising the question of who's entitled to this fortune. Hackman did appoint his former attorney as the person who would be in charge of this trust if Betsy Arakawa died, but that person died in 2019, so it was passed on to their successor, an attorney named Julia Peters, who is now representing the estate in court. According to Entertainment Weekly, Betsy's will says if Hackman doesn't outlive her by 90 days after her death, the estate is directed to be administered to a, quote, charitable trust to achieve purposes beneficial to the community, consistent with the charitable preferences and interests expressed or indicated by my spouse and me during our lifetimes. The attorney representing the trust did file documents in court listing Hackman's adult children as heirs to the trust. Now, we know that Hackman's children were not in touch with their dad regularly in his final days, as he is believed to have been dead for a week until a contractor found him and Betsy in the home. In a statement to People, his 2 daughters, Leslie and Elizabeth, and his granddaughter Annie said, quote, "It is with great sadness that we announce the passing of our father, Gene Hackman, and his wife, Betsy. He was loved and admired by millions around the world for his brilliant acting career, but to us, he was always just Dad and Grandpa. We will miss him sorely, and we are devastated by the loss." In an interview with the Daily Mail, Hackman's daughter Leslie said that she and her dad were close, but she hadn't spoken with him for a couple of months. Hackman's son Christopher, who is now in his 60s, hasn't spoken to the press since his father's death, but TMZ is reporting he did hire a prominent California trust and estate attorney. There are also questions about whether the public will see what deputies saw on that day that they discovered Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa had died. The attorney for Hackman's trust filed a motion to restrict body cam video and photographs. The estate was granted a temporary restraining order limiting the disclosure of pictures or videos showing the couple's bodies and interior of their home on that day. It also limits the disclosure of autopsy reports or death investigation reports. The trust argues that the Hackmans have a right to privacy and placed a lot of value on being out of the public eye in recent years. A hearing is set for March 31st to dive more into that issue. Joining us now, trial lawyer Randy Kessler, who also teaches at the Emory University School of Law. Thanks for taking the time to be with us as always here on Law and Crime. This is a fascinating development. I want to first start with this trust. $80 million is up for grabs. What does it tell you that the kids of Gene Hackman were not mentioned in this will, and he wanted to give everything to his wife, Betsy Arakawa Hackman?
You know, it seems like we're seeing that more and more, and we hear about these, multi-billionaires that say, I'm not giving it all to my kids. I'm going to do good with it for the world. But what's interesting is that it wasn't in some charity already. It wasn't already given to, some major cancer research institute. And if he wanted his kids to get money at his age, he could have been giving them money by now. It's interesting. That's a lot of the personality and the family dynamics that we're, I guess, going to learn a lot about when the kids start to try to get a piece of that $80 million. And I'm sure they're going to, and it's going to be a knockdown, drag out, given all the complexities, right? He was trying to give it to her, but you can't give it to somebody who predeceases you. And so then does it go into a trust or, I would not want to be that probate judge.
No, it seems complicated because even though this will was signed reportedly back in 2005, in your experience, I just imagine it's a pretty airtight type of document that can be difficult to fight if you wanted to change something after the fact, after somebody dies.
You would hope so. And right, that's why wills are the hardest things to change, because there's no one there to say, is this what you really meant? There's no cross-examination of the person saying, were you drunk when you signed it? That's why there's a lot of formality and a lot of witnesses and a lot of formality. And it takes a lot of formality to change a will. We hear about the term codicil. Someone doesn't want to do a new will, they add something to it. We call that a codicil. There's a lot of formality with that. You can't just say, hey, I want to write a letter to my lawyer that says, by the way, add another 20% for my oldest kid because I like him more. There's got to be a lot of formality to change a will. So when you sign your will, unless you go back and change it with the same formality that you signed it, it's going to stick in most cases. And I can't imagine that he had a lawyer that wasn't competent. The amount of money he had, I'm sure he had a decent lawyer to get a good will that's going to be enforceable.
I don't know what and I think many people don't know what truly the relationship was between Gene Hackman and his 3 adult children. 2 of his daughters did release a nice statement saying that they cared about him after they found out that he passed, but did say that they hadn't spoken in a couple of months. So it doesn't appear that they were regularly in contact with Gene Hackman. I mean, he had in some ways gone missing for a period of time, between when he died and when he was actually discovered, and they weren't the ones to figure that out. With that said, does the relationship between the person who died and then children who by blood are very close to them, but in terms of communication on a regular basis are not, does that factor into where money from a will could go if someone's trying to challenge it?
Yes, and I think it would be a much closer call if he had a good relationship with them, they were going to inherit everything, and then he met this new woman, and he married her, and he changed his will, and he cut everybody out, and he's got Alzheimer's. And then the calculus would be, maybe he didn't know what he was doing, maybe he was under duress, maybe she pressured him and defrauded him into signing everything over to her. But if the will was 20 years ago, when he was still making movies and still relevant and still with it, it's going to be very hard to say that he didn't know what he was doing when he signed that. It's going to be a lot more complicated. It's going to be, well, he knew what he was doing, but he didn't anticipate that the person he was giving the money to, who was much younger than him, would predecease him. What would he have wanted? What would he have done had he been able to predict that? Or is it going to be, well, he didn't predict it, so there's no living heir because he's already said it was all to go to her, and the state gets it, which is, now the state might have a conflict of interest. The judge is being paid by the state. Do you have a state judge in New Mexico deciding whether the state gets $80 million for its school fund, which is the default place that the money goes in New Mexico? Or do these children have some right to it, some equitable claim and some legal theory that says, Judge, you can modify this will given the unpredictable circumstances that his much younger wife actually predeceased him? It's going to be complicated. It's going to take some good lawyering.
Yeah, and I imagine too, if there was an argument to be made, in my non-legal opinion, you're the lawyer, but if this was a will that was signed in the last couple of years when Gene Hackman, he passed away from part of the big reason being Alzheimer's, and even the medical examiner said he was in really rough shape at 95 years old. This was back in 2005 when, by all accounts, he signed this document where he was still in very good health, as opposed to if this was something in the last 6 months, last 12 months, where you could argue his mental state wasn't in a good place.
That's exactly right. And it's very hard to challenge a properly signed and executed will because most lawyers are going to make sure they're not letting an incompetent client sign something and sign their rights away. But yeah, that's probably the hardest battle for the children, is that he signed this 20 years ago. And unless something else surfaces, and we've seen it all, there'll be a new will that shows up at the last second. Somebody found a new will or a codicil. But absent that, the will is probably going to be strictly interpreted. And if it says it goes to her or it's going into a trust for her, then if they can figure out what to do with the money based purely on looking at the 4 corners of the document, looking at the will, that's going to govern. The problem is if what he says in the will should happen can't happen. Like if he says, I'm going to give it to her and she's not there anymore, court has to figure out, does it go to who she would want it to go to? No, because she's not there anymore. It's, sort of like a divorce in some ways. If I leave all my money to my wife, but then we get divorced, obviously I don't want her to get it. So it goes to my next wife or whoever, or my kids or something like that. You've got this intervening act that nobody anticipated, which is the wife dying before the husband. and the court's going to have to interpret it along with the law. And I don't have the document in front of me. Maybe the will contemplates that in some way. Maybe the will says it will go to her or to her designated trust or her designated people. It doesn't sound like it. It sounds like it's confusing. But we're going to see it all. It's all going to be spelled out, and good lawyers are going to make it easy for the judge to understand, which means it'll be easy for us to understand once it all comes out.
What I find fascinating in this too is that, when you think of someone writing a will and, well, if I die before you die or you die before I die, elderly couples, I mean, she was 65. You're assuming that it would be a case where he dies at 95 years old. And then she's, there's years where she has access to this money and it's kind of cut and dry. But these documents, even in the case of a couple of days, I mean, literally to the point where the first person to pass away is what triggers this. Is there ever any kind of buffer time in there where you're not talking about these long periods of time? But if someone, I'm just thinking hypothetically here, if someone dies like 20 minutes before somebody else, does that still factor into the will typically, where as opposed to like a 30-year period?
Chris, only if you're clever enough as a lawyer to write that into the will. I mean, that comes up a lot in a car accident. Imagine the Scientology and the DNA, if the car was struck on the driver's side, did the driver pass before the passenger? And in that case, then the passenger inherited from the driver, and then the passenger's will controls. There are ways you can do it in a will, and you can say, if they die simultaneously, here's what's going to happen. If it's within a few minutes and it's hard to determine who died first, then here's what we decide. But that's usually two people that jointly own the wealth, and they're both trying to figure out where it goes. It doesn't sound like that's in this will. I think we would have heard that. It sounds like she predeceased him, and so who does the money go to if the person he designated is no longer alive? You can't give money to a dead person.
No. And I think and this is $80 million, very unique circumstances in how they passed away. Have you ever seen in kind of just working in the legal profession and with celebrities when they pass away, some of these will issues? How does this compare to some of the others that you've seen?
Well, the one that jumps to mind was the Prince, right? Prince didn't have any, he wasn't married, and the children were a different issue for him. So he apparently didn't get a will. And so it brought this to light, the Anna Nicole Smith situation. All these are just good lessons for the average person and the non-average person. Get a will, or at least talk to a lawyer and figure out what happens, if and when you die, and a lot of us still use that term, if I die, newsflash, right? Everyone's going to go sometime. It's going to happen. Why are we so afraid to think about it and plan for it and prepare for it? Talk to a lawyer, figure out what should happen, and think about worst case scenario. If I die before you, if you die before me, if I die before you and our child has special needs, there's so many variables, but the more you can do for your loved ones, it saves this kind of aggravation, this kind of fight, and it also cuts us lawyers out of a lot of money if you can figure out what to do with the money once you're gone.
As far another part of this story that's been an interesting development is when she died. Now, it doesn't change the fact that she likely went before he did. It was about 24 hours compared to the initial timeline that law enforcement gave. How common is it to see something like that where the cell phone records come back and surprise, surprise, she didn't die on the 11th, she died on the 12th because she was making phone calls that day?
It's not that common because usually when people are married, their wills are mirror wills, right? If I die first, the money goes to you. If you die first, the money goes to me. And if we both die, it goes to our kids. And by the way, when your money goes to me and then I die, it goes to our kids. And if my money goes to you when I die and you die next, then the money goes to the kids. So usually you're all on the same page. This is rare because it's one side's extremely wealthy. And, the flip side, and what makes this case fascinating, is it's not the typical that you read about in the tabloids. Oh, he was 95 years old and he met a 20-year-old who we know just wanted him for his money and that was it. And she married him, made him change his will. And now the kids are upset because she deceived him and defrauded him. We don't have any of that. By all, accounts, this was a legitimate, solid relationship, and they cared about each other. So it's going to be hard to attack what he put in the will. But if the will doesn't leave it out, doesn't say, here's what happens to the money if the person I'm leaving to is gone, then it's going to be between the children and the school fund of New Mexico to see who gets the money. And that could be a bitter fight.
Yeah, that would be a bitter fight. We know reportedly it's from TMZ, but the eldest son or the only son of Gene Hackman, who's a full grown now, has hired an estate attorney. So theoretically, he's gearing up for potentially a fight
Well,
to
they
try and
should.
get at least some of that. I mean, you're talking about $80 million. It's a lot of money.
Yeah, even if they and maybe I don't know these people, right? Maybe the kids know what dad would have wanted, and they want the money to make sure it goes to the charities that he supported, or to
Yeah.
do something in the performing arts. You know, who knows? But they should at least get a lawyer and know their rights. When there's that much money involved, there's so much good you can do with that. And you know, what would dad have wanted to do? And we don't know the children's needs, and do they have significant financial hardships, or do they not? There are a lot of variables, but I would at least talk to a lawyer and say, is there a chance that the money's coming to me from me and my children and my family, or what's going to happen to it if I don't get it? You know, to learn that it's going to go to the school fund for the state of New Mexico, and maybe that's fine with everybody. But they should at least know their rights.
And we know that the trust is also, they're in the process of attempting to stop the release of body cam video, photographs from inside the home the day that Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa Hackman were found, interior images of their home that would be released as part of that, as we've seen in a lot of other cases, even the autopsies trying to restrict those from being released. They're arguing that, especially in his later years, Gene Hackman was a very private person, and so is Betsy Arakawa, and they have that right to privacy. Where do you stand on that?
Keep it private, right? I don't know the legal answer to it. It's not a criminal case. There's not a criminal investigation. You know, the reason it's available in criminal cases is because we are all sort of parties to the case. It's the state versus somebody. You know, it's not, you know, victim versus defendant. It's the state on behalf of the victim prosecuting the defendant. So in a civil situation like this, where they're just trying to figure out the will, if that's who he was, if he was private, why do we need to know? If anyone wants to see Gene Hackman, go rent a movie. I mean, there's so many ways to see Gene Hackman. And it's probably the way he would want to be remembered, not the way he was in his final years. I would support keeping it private if it was up to me.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. The judge giving a temporary restraining order, and then they're expected to have a hearing on March 31st. And that is an interesting point, because it is not a criminal case. Foul play was never considered in this whatsoever, because New Mexico is a state that typically does release body camera video, but it's for, and we see it on Law and Crime all the time, someone shoplifting from Target, someone in a high-speed chase. This clearly, though, is a very different kind of case. But at the same time, there is a lot of public interest in Gene Hackman, and there was a lot of public interest that fueled this story.
And in lawsuits, and it may depend on whether it's a litigated lawsuit. You guys have to file sometimes motions to get courtroom cameras or get access to what's going on in a courtroom. The public has a right to know how our system works and what's going on in the judicial system. So if it's something that's going to be introduced as evidence, if it's a courtroom drama or courtroom case, maybe. But just while it's in the investigation period, I don't know what would justify releasing it to the public. And the real question is going to be, who's acting on behalf of this guy? Who is his representative? Does he have somebody hired? Does he have somebody appointed as his executor, as the administrator of his estate, that's going to stand up and say, here's what I'm arguing on behalf of Mr. Hackman, and let them make the arguments. But I can't imagine whoever that is, they're going to just roll over and say, yeah, put the video out there. He wouldn't care. Sounds like he didn't go out in public for a lot of reasons. He wants his memory to be what we remember him, I imagine.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens. Yeah, March 31st is that next hearing. And this is a fascinating case. I mean, I think of the day that it first came down, and then all these questions rose up, and then came to somewhat of a resolution at the time with their causes of death. But then more details come up, and we'll see what happens with the estate. Randy Kessler, thank you for taking the time to be with us, as always, here on Law and Crime.
Thank you, Chris.
We will continue to follow this story, as so many people are interested. For On the Case, presented by Law and Crime, I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.